Tēnā koutou, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou, koe tai mai a ipurangi, ki te whakarongo ki te kōrero nei. Ki ngā tangata whenua, huri no i te ao, tēnei te mihi. Ki ngā mati o te wā, haere atu rā. Huri noa ki a tātou te honga ora, tēnā no tātou katoa. Kia ora, I'm Donna Cormack and my tribal affiliations are to Kaitahu and Kāti Mamoi in the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm a teacher and researcher in Māori health, and I'm happy to be presenting with Hana today, who I'm thinking alongside in the genomic space. Our talk explores how, as Māori, we can honour and uphold our intergenerational relationships through whakapapa, as genomic research and technologies become increasingly common in our society. Grounded in Māori worldviews, we consider the role genomic research and technologies have in realising our wider aspirations as Māori, namely to be in good relation. And we also consider how we can navigate genomics in a way that honours our whakapapa relationships within and between generations. We acknowledge that our ancestors have always found creative ways to engage with the changing world around us. And being grounded in Māori worldviews can continue to provide a way to think through engaging with science and technology. We can think through how we can be in good relation with new ideas and technologies, including those in the field of genomics. In this presentation, we're going to focus on population health genomics as a context, that is genomics in relation to its application to public health and population health inequities, rather than in terms of specific genetic conditions at the level of the individual or family, or the genomics of tumours, viruses, or other organisms, or DNA technologies more broadly. And I'm now going to pass over to Hana to introduce yourself and speak.
Kia ora, ko Hana tōku ingoa, hiri tēnei no ngā puhi te ati haunoi a Pāparangi. My name's Hana and I am a descendant of ngā puhi in the north island of Aotearoa and of te ati haunoi a Pāparangi, which is the iwi of the Wanganui River. Yeah, I am a PhD student at the moment thinking in this space, and Donna is my supervisor slash colleague, friend, co-theorist, co-creator. I thought it would be useful to begin our kōrero to speak a bit into my journey as a PhD student in this space, and how returning to Māori ways of being, knowing and doing has allowed us to engage deeply, not only in genomics, but what it means to be well as Māori, or as Indigenous people. I remember at the beginning of my PhD journey, I was finding it really difficult to get my head around genomics and what Māori engagement in genomics could look like. I vividly remember I had like this mind map I made where I had like genomics at the center and I had all of these arrows coming out of it. And it was like healthcare, research, ethics, legislation, tissues, blood and genes, data sovereignty, Māori worldviews, tikanga, colonization. I had just, it was a mess. It felt so complex and I wasn't seeing clearly. Like I couldn't make sense of this, not only for my PhD topic, but for my whānau and for my community. And it was then I kind of came to this realization, or was something that I'd already known, that as Māori, our world is relational and we exist through our intergenerational relationships. So surely this would be my starting point, right? So I'd realized that I'd been centering genomics, like as it exists now, and then thinking about Māori worldviews and understandings as kind of like this thing that we can add on top of this existing space, or it was kind of like this, just this layer over the top of genomics. And it was so difficult because there is so much about genomics that is fundamentally misaligned with Māori worldviews. And so we need to think critically, not only about genomic science and research, but about settler colonial society and what it means to be well as Māori. So from there and from this shifting of the center, like from genomics to being Māori, it meant for us leaning really deeply into theory, into Indigenous theory. And it meant thinking around genomics, not just in terms of risk and benefits for the here and now, but beyond that. Thinking beyond human populations and towards the impacts that genomics and the framing and narratives around genomics have on our Māori world. So now I'll talk through whakapapa and how this shapes our understanding of the world as Māori. Whakapapa is a concept that explains the origin and positioning of all things. Whakapapa derives from the root papa, meaning base or foundation. Whakapapa denotes a layering and adding to that foundation. So rooted in creation, generations layer upon each other, creating a reality of intergenerational relationships. Everything has a whakapapa, all phenomena, spiritual and physical, from celestial bodies, days and nights, through to the winds, lands, waters, and all that transpires throughout. Whakapapa is often translated to the Western concept of genealogy, which can confine it to the past and make it appear to be primarily focused on human relationships of biological descent. However, as Māori, we understand whakapapa as much more expansive. Whakapapa is just as concerned with future generations and how our past and future generations relate to the rest of existence. So in knowing something's whakapapa, or the layers that make it up, you can come to know how it came to be, how it relates to wider existence, and how it will come to be in the future. Whakapapa allows us to understand the world and all its complexities. It not only provides a body of knowledge, but a way of comprehending the universe, forming the foundations of Māori ways of being, knowing, and doing. And this establishes important guidelines for how to be in relation with the rest of existence. Through whakapapa, all of existence is whanaunga, existing in the natural state of whanaungatanga. Whanaunga can be understood as this notion of being in good relation. The notion of being in good relation within and between generations is a common thread among Indigenous peoples, weaving together the existence of Indigenous peoples, lands, and oceans worldwide. Intergenerational relationships through whakapapa are the central nature of all reality and are ontologically privileged in Māori thought. So for us, to be is to be in relation. We exist not as separate individuals, but as wider collectives that emerge from and are sustained by our intimate relationships with the natural world. From the land to the ocean and beyond, our descent is layered through our whānau, hapua, and iwi, our collective groups, to the whenua and the landscapes of these ancestral areas, including our mountains, rivers, lakes, and oceans. Within this worldview, nothing exists in isolation. In fact, the notion of isolation is a fallacy. Everything in existence is infinitely and complexly in relation all the time. There are no breaks, no stops, no ends. Life is a continuously unfolding whole. This shapes a reality of interdependency, where the well-being of the whole is dependent on the well-being of its closely related components, and vice versa. When these relationships are at their natural state of balance, we are well. So within this context, we can come to understand settler colonialism. Settler colonialism, in short, can be understood as the violent damaging and disrupting of our relational worlds, the damaging and disrupting of whanaungatanga. Upon damaging and disrupting whanaungatanga, new settler colonial ways of being, knowing, and doing have been established. Settler colonialism ontologically privileges isolation, reduction, separation, and severing, unnaturally placing the individual human, white, straight, cis, able-bodied Christian men, to be more specific, at the pinnacle of existence. On the basis of such ontologies, whanaungatanga is replaced by settler colonial relationships that are premised on systems of domination, exploitation, possession, and commodification. Genomics is not divorced from this context. Genomics is intimately intertwined with settler colonialism. So critical engagement with this is a necessary step of making sense of our engagement in this space in genomics. I'll hand over to Donna now, who will speak to this in more depth.
So, as Hana has said, it's important for us to be attentive to the context within which discussions about genomics occur. And for Māori, this includes a context that's already in all ways racialised and colonial, and where, as Hana's noted, prevailing approaches to science embody extractive and consumptive logics. In this respect, the work of decolonial theorists and scholars remind us how divisions between human groups are central to colonialism, that race became the line that demarcated colonizers from colonized, and that social relations and experiences, including genomics, all happen within a context that's already racialized. And so we need to always be attentive to the qualitative difference of lived realities above and below this primary dividing line, what Ramon Grossfiguel refers to as the transversal line. How are genomic technologies experienced in these different spaces above and below the line of the human? Māori know at a visceral level the practices of naming, labeling, categorizing, measuring, and surveilling that have been part of historical practices of colonization and remain part of ongoing coloniality. Māori scholar Cheryl Smith refers to this as cultures of collecting, whereby Indigenous peoples become objects to collect, to gaze at, to exhibit, commodified as tradable products, or consumed as exotic curiosities. Colonial systems produce new classifications to define and describe Māori as a population. State systems of defining who was Māori reflected worldviews that conceptualized identity in racialized biological terms that sought to break Māori down into parts, using narratives of blood quantum and proportions of descent, in contrast to the deep, interconnected, and multiple ways of relating and identifying for Māori. And in this sense, we can think about narratives that seek to define being Māori populations only or primarily through DNA as a continuation of these reductionist biological notions of identity that emphasize the parts rather than the whole, and that elevate biological conceptualizations over relational ways of being and thinking. From a whakapapa orientation, an understanding of genomics gives us information about one layer of our expansive existence. It's important because it's linked to us and thereby linked to our whānau. However, it's not understood as the core or the foundation of our existence. A whakapapa or relational perspective of genomics disrupts what is reproduced in prevailing approaches to population genomics by challenging the notion of a hierarchy of knowledge where, to use Sylvia Winter's terminology, biocentric notions of the human are at the centre, and by which westernized science has come to assume or presume a greater credibility than Indigenous ways of knowing ourselves. A whakapapa approach to genomics also challenges central assumptions of settler colonial science, including ideas of objectivity, reductionism, and universalism, and narratives of progress or development. Genomics can tell us part of our biological story. For example, it can give us information about how we connect to others in our immediate biological family. Genomics can also help us in understanding particular health conditions to guide diagnosis and decision-making around what people might want to do. And this research can be critical for families with certain health conditions. However, genomics is also employed to attempt to tell stories about Indigenous peoples that it can't or shouldn't tell. Many of the recirculating genomics discourses back up rather than unsettle broader colonial narratives. Genomics cannot tell us who we are. While genomics may provide some information about some biological links to some ancestors, this will always be a partial story rather than a full representation of the multiple connections and relationships that we have. In this sense, genomics cannot tell us if we are Māori or not. If being Māori is about having whakapapa connections, being descended from certain ancestors, then our genes are not a measure of that. In much genomic health research, however, population groups are used in ways that, as constructs in ways that are decontextualized and ahistorical. As Kim Tallbear reminds us in talking about the idea of Native American DNA, that Native American DNA could not have emerged as an object of scientific research and genealogical desire until individuals and groups emerged as Native American in the course of colonial history, end quote. Much genomic research does not engage with the discussions and debates that have happened in other spaces around what these population categories represent. Scientists tend not to situate their practice within the history of their disciplines, and what Teferi Zabuki has critiqued as the white logics that are embedded in many of the statistical techniques and methods used in population genomics. We suggest that there's an active ignorance of the ways in which population groups are socially, politically, and culturally constituted. That means that genomic scientists and researchers do not engage with the critiques of race as biology, with the scholarship and theorizing from other spaces about the situated and socially constructed nature of race, including critiques from Indigenous studies and Indigenous researchers. It's entirely possible, and not that uncommon, for research to be published making population genetic claims about Māori as an ethnic group that pays no critical attention to the way in which the population is conceptualized, nor what the use of racial or ethnic categories might mean more broadly. In line with progress narratives that are foundational in colonial discourses, population genomics is also represented as containing both explanations and solutions for the racial health inequities created by settler colonialism. And in doing this, there's a real danger that the fundamental underlying drivers of population health inequities, that is colonialism and its attendant systems of oppression, including capitalism and racism, are minimized or dismissed. Health inequities represent a racialized colonial capitalist system functioning as it should, rather than something anomalous that can be corrected within the same logics that created the problem. And I'll just hand back to Hana to finish off.
Kia ora, Donna. So from this, in contextualizing genomics in its broader context, we can understand where genomics has come from and where it is going. We can understand its place in the colonial project, and we can begin to understand what that means for us as Māori, if we choose to engage or not in this space. Importantly, we need to center our worlds. We can put our well-being, our whānau, and our communities at the center of our frame. And from here, we can collectively envision what it means to be well. We can envision what it means to be in relation with the many layers of our existence, through our communities, to our lands and waters, and all that makes us who we are. And it is from here that we can query genomics. In putting our collective well-being at the center and the futures we envision, we query the role, if any, genomics has in our envisioned futures. And we certainly do not want to be involved in research and practice that keeps us oppressed and keeps us unwell, and further from these futures that we envision for ourselves and our descendants. It is through whakapapa and whanaungatanga that we consider rather how we can be included in genomics, but how genomics can be included in our world and under what conditions. We consider what sort of agreements, relationships, and levels of trust are necessary for us to be able to honor and uphold our intergenerational relationships. Because genomics can have a place in our futures, we just need to be clear of that place. We need to be clear about the stories it can tell and the stories it can't tell, and what this is all doing in the way of our broader relationships. Genomics doesn't have all the answers, but whakapapa does. The creation, maintenance, and strengthening of relationships is the basis of our worlds, and also the basis for negotiating permissions and restrictions, as evident in many of our ways of being and doing and knowing as Māori. Our tupuna have left us foundations through which we can navigate genomics. And as the multiplicity of relationships, environments, and contexts that make up our world change through time, so too do our processes of navigating permissions and restrictions. This is something we've always done. Our knowledge systems have always been fluid and contextual. It is about connecting to these knowledge systems and envisioning what these can look like for us in our futures. Importantly, as Indigenous peoples, we need the time and space to be still and to sit in these complexities together, according to our own tikanga. We need time and space where genomics and the goals, ambitions of careers of non-Indigenous scientists are not at the center of our discussions. There is no one answer to how we might engage with genomics, and we don't have the answer today. But we know that it begins with a returning to Indigenous knowledge systems, a returning to who we are, Māori. Mōri ora.